Hamilton County father has been found guilty in the murder of his 2-year-old daughter. A jury found Glenn Bates guilty of aggravated murder, and child endangerment. Closing arguments were heard this afternoon. The jury came back with their verdict 2 hours later.
It was Christmas of 2014. Peg Fontaine stood on the front porch of a familiar house, one she had visited many times before. She carried a bag of wrapped gifts, smiling with hope, ready to see the children she once cared for, but this time no one answered the door. Through the glass she spotted a figure, a little girl, barely moving, just standing there. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't blink, she just stared. There was something in that moment, something deeply unsettling. Peg couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her chest. The child she had once known as joyful and energetic wasn't there anymore, not really. She left the gifts on the porch. She walked away, but that image stayed with her. What Peg didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this would be one of the last times anyone outside that house saw Glenara Bates. She wasn't missing, but she was fading from view, right in front of everyone. Glenara was just 2 years old, a toddler who had once laughed, played, and thrived in the care of foster parents who loved her like their own. She had been safe, stable, and growing. But the decisions made by a system meant to protect her would soon take her down a very different path. That holiday visit was more than a family check-in. It was a quiet alarm, a signal no one would recognize until it was too late. In the weeks that followed, the signs that something wasn't right became harder to ignore, but still, no one stepped in. Not until Glenara was brought to a hospital in a condition that left even experienced professionals unsure of what they were seeing. But by then, it was beyond the point of help. What happened to Glenara Bates would later be recognized as one of the most severe breakdowns in Ohio's child protection process. It revealed more than individual mistakes. It showed the ripple effect of missed signals and what can happen when oversight fails. This documentary will follow her journey from the bright early days in foster care to the missed opportunities to the final moments no child should ever face. Along the way, we'll examine the roles of those involved, the caregivers, the professionals, the investigators, and the institutions that had every chance to act but didn't. This is not fiction. This is a real case involving real people, a child who needed protection, a system that was built to provide it, and a community left grappling with how it all slipped through the cracks. Before we continue, please be advised, this documentary discusses sensitive events surrounding a young child and the decisions made on her behalf. While care has been taken to present the facts respectfully, viewer discretion is advised. If you believe in the importance of protecting vulnerable children, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps amplify the stories that need to be heard. By subscribing, liking, or sharing this video, you become part of a growing voice that says every child deserves to be seen and safeguarded. She was born in January 2013, earlier than expected. Glenara Bates entered the world at 34 weeks. She weighed just over 4 pounds. Medical notes from that day highlighted concerns she was small for her gestational age, and certain prenatal conditions had gone unaddressed. No record of maternal checkups, no prenatal support. Test results pointed to exposure that raised immediate concern with local authorities. It didn't take long for action to be taken. Based on long-standing procedures, Glenara was placed into care within days. At the time, her mother, Andrea Bradley, had a prior record with social services. There were previous investigations. Support staff documented that intervention had occurred before. The case was reviewed, and Glenara's placement was confirmed. That's how she arrived at the home of Peg and Michael Fontaine. The Fontaines were experienced foster parents. They had already opened their doors to 4 of Glenara's older half-siblings and were known for consistency, patience, and care. The home was quiet, structured, and centered on healing. Glenara adapted quickly. Peg described her in those early weeks as bright-eyed and peaceful. "Our happy Buddha baby," she would later recall. Glenara smiled often. She began to grow. Her appetite was strong, her motor development on track, and she connected deeply with those around her. Photos from that time capture a child at peace, curious, responsive, and increasingly expressive. In just a few months, Glenara had reached every developmental milestone set for her age group. She became known for her laughter, her strong grip, her love of being held. The Fontaines kept detailed records of her growth. They attended all her pediatric checkups. Her well-being became their priority. They didn't see this as temporary care. They hoped, genuinely, that Glenara might become a permanent part of their family. As they nurtured her, they also began inquiring about the legal process. Adoption wasn't guaranteed, but based on her rapid progress and the consistent environment they had provided, they believed she might stay. They submitted formal interest to the appropriate caseworker. At the time, no final decisions had been made, but the Fontaines were ready to commit fully. Peg would later testify, "We loved her like she was ours." And Glenara, by all accounts, responded to that love in kind. For 8 months, she lived in that home. During that time, nothing suggested that her placement should be changed. She was active, she was healthy, she was forming strong, secure attachments, but reunification with birth parents remained the policy goal. The Fontaines understood the system. They knew the guidelines. But they had also seen firsthand what stability could do for a child, and they hoped more than anything that their efforts would be seen as more than just temporary support. Still, the process began to shift. There were reports filed about Andrea Bradley's progress. Case files were being updated. A court review was scheduled. No final ruling had come down, but for the Fontaines, the signs were hard to ignore. They continued to advocate for Glenara. They complied with every requirement. They made their home available for ongoing evaluation. They didn't step away. Even as questions about her future placement began circulating, they stayed committed. Because for them, Glenara wasn't just a file or a foster child. She was family. If you believe no child should be removed from a loving home without clear and compelling reason, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Because when the signs of safety are clear and the consequences of disruption are real, every voice matters. In September 2013, Glenara Bates and 4 of her siblings were sent back to live with their biological mother, Andrea Bradley. The decision was approved in Hamilton County Family Court after service records indicated compliance. Andrea had attended required parenting programs and maintained scheduled meetings with caseworkers. These steps were viewed as indicators of progress, and the court accepted the recommendation for reunification. The ruling included one stipulation: a 3-month period of observation. If no issues were reported during that window, the case would be closed. The Fontaines, who had cared for Glenara and several of her siblings in foster placement, immediately raised concerns. Peg Fontaine contacted the assigned caseworker and questioned whether the reunification was in the children's best interest. She pointed to previous history and expressed unease about the sudden transition. Her concerns were documented, but no delay was issued. The oldest sibling, however, was not returned to Andrea's household. Instead, that child was placed in the care of Dana Bradley, Glenara's grandmother. Dana had long been involved in the children's lives and was considered a source of steadiness. Still, she was not given guardianship over the younger children and had no decision-making authority for Glenara. Andrea's history with protective services stretched back several years. In 2009, a court ruling found fault in a prior case involving one of her children. That outcome led to a mental health assessment. She was diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. After a brief hospitalization, she resumed care of her children under supervision. No further action was taken. By the time Glenara was returned in 2013, Andrea was no longer living alone. She had entered a relationship with a man named Glenn Bates. Records at the time did not list any disqualifying convictions against Bates. However, those familiar with the household later shared that his demeanor had caused concern. He was described as unpredictable, and some who knew the family questioned whether proper evaluations had been completed. Peg Fontaine made multiple calls to child services during this period. She informed officials that Bates was now present in the home with the children. She asked whether background checks had been conducted and whether additional oversight would be added. There is no public record of any new assessment being made. No home review was scheduled, no court hearing was reopened. The 3-month monitoring period came and went, and with no new reports submitted during that time, the case was closed. The reunification was considered complete. The agency signed off. From the system's perspective, the matter had been resolved. But what was documented in the file and what was happening behind closed doors would soon prove to be very different things. In December 2014, Peg Fontaine returned to the house on Hackberry Street. She came with a car full of gifts, planning to visit the children she had once fostered. It was a simple gesture, one rooted in care and consistency, but something wasn't right. When she knocked on the door, no one answered. She waited. Knocked again. Through the front window, Peg spotted one of the children. The little girl was just standing there, still, silent, watching. Peg called out. No response. No wave. No smile. She eventually placed the presents on the porch and walked away, unsettled by what she had seen. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling that something inside the home had shifted, and not in a good way. That same month, Glenara was taken to the hospital. According to medical notes, she weighed just over 17 pounds. That was more than 3 pounds less than her weight during foster care a year earlier. The change in growth trajectory was significant. She had also lost the ability to stand without assistance. She was admitted for observation. Fluids were administered, and nutritional intake was monitored. After approximately 10 days, she had gained some weight. Her discharge plan included feeding recommendations and a suggestion to follow up with outpatient care, but no mandatory report was filed with child services. Despite the significant weight loss and a documented history of involvement, the case was not flagged for reevaluation. No investigation was reopened. Glenara was released to her mother with only verbal guidance. In early 2015, Peg Fontaine filed another report. She couldn't let go of what she had seen at Christmas. She contacted authorities and shared her concerns. That March, a child protective services worker was assigned to conduct a home visit. The result of that visit was brief and would later become central to public scrutiny. According to the report, the house was clean. The child appeared happy and healthy. No further action was recommended. The visit was documented and the file was closed. Officials later confirmed that no second opinion was sought and no medical follow-up was ordered as part of that visit. When the case became public months later, Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe Detters made a direct statement. We opposed her being returned from the start, and what happened afterward confirmed every concern we had. Following the investigation, Maura Weir, Director of Hamilton County Job and Family Services, addressed the agency's role. "We did not follow internal protocols," she admitted in a public hearing, and because of that, key steps were missed. By every official account, Glenara should have been reviewed more thoroughly. She had previous involvement with the agency. She had lost weight. Reports had been filed, and yet none of that triggered renewed oversight. The red flags were there, but they weren't acted on. And when the final file was reviewed, it showed a conclusion that contradicted everything the child's history had already revealed. A system designed to intervene had closed her case with a single sentence. The opportunity to protect her wasn't lost overnight. It faded quietly over months of silence. On the morning of March 29, 2015, Andrea Bradley arrived at the emergency department at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. In her arms was her daughter, Glenara. Medical personnel were immediately called to respond. At first glance, something didn't add up. Staff described confusion about the child's age. Glenara appeared significantly smaller than expected. Her size and condition led some to believe she was an infant, not a 2-year-old. She was cold to the touch and unresponsive. Medical teams attempted standard resuscitation protocols. They checked vital signs, administered care, and reviewed her physical state. Despite their efforts, Glenara passed away at exactly 1 p.m. As required, the hospital alerted the Hamilton County Coroner's Office for further review. Dr. Karen Strait, one of the first physicians to examine Glenara, noted immediately that her overall condition did not reflect what would be expected of a healthy 2-year-old. Her appearance, body weight, and physical state prompted immediate concern and triggered a full-scale investigation. The case was assigned to Dr. Jennifer Scott with the coroner's office. During her assessment, Dr. Scott determined that Glenara's situation was not the result of a single isolated event. Her findings pointed not to a sudden incident, but a prolonged absence of proper care. Additionally, Glenara had sustained a head injury that had not been treated prior to her arrival at the hospital. The findings were escalated for official review. Dr. Lakshmi Kode Samarko, Hamilton County's chief coroner, later described the case as one of the most serious examples of ongoing neglect that she had encountered in her professional experience. She emphasized that it was not only the condition itself that raised concern, but the complete absence of medical follow-up prior to the hospital visit. As Glenara's case was entered into formal records, staff began reviewing her history. There were no recent pediatric visits listed, no records from urgent care, no calls from the home requesting assistance. Nothing in the medical system showed that steps had been taken to address the child's condition prior to that morning. What left the deepest impression on investigators and healthcare providers was not just what they saw, it was what they didn't see. There had been no warning from the caregivers, no attempt to seek help, no urgency. Time had been available, but no one had acted, and when that silence was finally broken, it was already too late to change the outcome. The questions began within hours of the hospital report being filed. Detectives Marcus McNeil, Bill Hilbert, and Eric Karigaloff started with the person who had been in the home with Glenara during her final hours, Glenn Bates. In the first interview, Bates appeared emotionally distant. He described Glenara as having looked tired and cold and claimed he had no idea what was wrong. He said she had eaten, gone to sleep, and never woke up. But his tone raised concern. Detectives noted how neutral he remained even when discussing what should have been an urgent event. When asked about visible concerns noticed at the hospital, Bates hesitated. Then, for the first time, he brought up something else. "We play this game," he said, "doggy gonna get you." According to him, it was a joke. He would chase Glenara around and lightly grab her with his teeth on the arm or side. Investigators pressed further. Bates admitted he may have bit too hard, but insisted it wasn't meant to hurt. Detectives paused the session and ordered a forensic dental comparison. Days later, Bates was brought in again. His story changed. Now, he said Glenara had experienced a fall a few days earlier. He claimed he had picked her up by her legs during a playful moment and that she had slipped and hit her head. He said her shoes had come off and she landed hard. When asked why medical help wasn't called, Bates said Glenara seemed okay and Andrea had handled it at home. That statement immediately raised concern. Investigators asked how the wound had been treated. Bates replied, "Just regular thread, like sewing stuff. Andrea fixed it. He said it was small and didn't seem serious, but he couldn't explain why they hadn't called a doctor or gone to urgent care." Andrea Bradley's interview followed shortly after. She was read her rights and asked to describe the days leading up to March 29. Andrea said Glenara hadn't been feeling well and that they had tried giving her fluid. When asked about the injury, she acknowledged closing it herself with items from the house. She didn't explain why professional care hadn't been sought. As the conversation continued, she mentioned that Glenn could be controlling and that she wasn't sure how serious the injury was. She believed Glenara would rest and recover. Meanwhile, forensic results returned from the lab. Bite pattern impressions were reviewed and matched to both Glenn Bates and Andrea Bradley. Experts confirmed that the spacing and angles aligned with adult teeth and that the patterns were consistent with the reports investigators had heard. Dr. Jennifer Scott, the Hamilton County Deputy Coroner, performed Glenara's examination. She documented a combination of new and older signs that pointed to ongoing harm. According to her findings, the child's condition indicated a prolonged absence of adequate nutrition and care. She noted that the injury to Glenara's head, based on the tissue response and appearance, had occurred roughly 24 to 48 hours before she was brought to the hospital. It had not been treated properly and had shown signs of infection. Dr. Scott also noted that the injury was inconsistent with a simple fall. The location and depth raised the likelihood of forceful contact. She documented that the child had experienced more than one prior injury that had not been professionally addressed. The location and condition of the wound did not support the idea of a simple accident. Dr. Scott documented that the contact appeared forceful and that it was not consistent with an ordinary fall. Her report also noted other prior concerns that had not been addressed medically. Police requested a third interview with Glenn Bates. This time, Bates altered his version once more. He still claimed Glenara had fallen, but added that she slipped harder than he expected. He said she cried briefly, then stopped. When asked why emergency help wasn't sought, he stated that Andrea didn't think it warranted it and they didn't want trouble. Detectives found inconsistencies. Over 3 interviews, they had heard 3 different explanations. None aligned with what the forensic evidence showed. Then came the statement from Glenara's older sister. She was 10 years old. During her interview, she told detectives that the injury happened the night before the hospital visit. She told investigators she witnessed Glenn Bates lift Glenara by the legs and make forceful contact between her and the wall. Afterward, Glenara had been quiet. No one called for help. Her account was detailed, and it matched both the timeline and Dr. Scott's medical analysis. Presented with this statement, both Bates and Bradley chose not to provide further comment. Hamilton County Coroner Dr. Lashmi Samarco later reviewed the full report. In a televised interview, she called it a case of persistent neglect, emphasizing that the real issue wasn't a single event, but the absence of response over time. Every layer of the investigation pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't an unpredictable emergency. It was a series of chances to intervene, each one missed. There had been time, there had been signs, but instead of action there was silence. Investigators compiled the case step by step. There were no assumptions, no guesses, just facts, timelines, contradictions, proof. And when all of it came together, the picture was clear. In October 2016, the courtroom of Judge Robert Ruhlman delivered its verdict in the case against Glenn Bates. After weeks of testimony, forensic review, and witness accounts, the jury reached a unanimous conclusion. In October 2016, Glenn Bates was convicted of aggravated murder by a Hamilton County jury following a full trial and presentation of forensic and testimonial evidence.
After receiving this type of trauma, you're not going to be crying, you're not going to be eating, you're not going to be walking, you're not going to be doing anything. All you're going to be doing is dying. And that's what happened in this case.
The conviction, under Ohio law, allowed for the most severe form of sentencing available at the time. The recommendation, capital punishment commonly referred to as the death penalty. Judge Ruhlman confirmed the jury's decision, formally sentencing Bates to the highest penalty permitted by the state. According to court notes, Bates showed minimal emotion as the sentence was read. Prosecutors argued that the consistent pattern of inaction and neglect warranted the full weight of the law. Years later, that decision would be reversed. In 2023, the sentence was overturned following a successful appeal. The appellate court ruled that the original trial was compromised by juror selection issues, including the seating of a juror with documented racial bias. This procedural error was deemed sufficient to invalidate the original sentencing phase. Rather than proceed to a second capital trial, Bates accepted a plea agreement. Under its terms, he was resentenced to 25 years in prison with credit for 8 years already served. This adjustment means he will be eligible for supervised release later in life, pending parole board review. Andrea Bradley, Glenara's mother, never stood before a jury. At the time of her arrest, she was in the later stages of pregnancy. During pre-trial hearings, her defense presented documentation showing that her cognitive assessment placed her below the legal threshold for capital sentencing. As outlined in precedent set by the U.S. Supreme Court, individuals with intellectual disabilities cannot be subjected to the most severe sentencing options. Andrea entered a plea of no contest and was sentenced to 15 years to life. When asked if she wished to address the court, she responded, "Give the world what it wants. I don't care." Her demeanor was noted in official records, but no additional statement was made. The most impactful voice in the courtroom came from a child. Testimony from Glenara's 10-year-old sister was presented under protected status. While her words were not shared publicly, sources close to the courtroom confirmed that her detailed account of events had a strong influence on jurors. According to court officials, her recollection aligned with the timeline and played a key role in establishing critical facts. Also present was Bonita Crum, Glenn Bates's mother. She addressed the court during the sentencing phase. Through tears, she asked for understanding, saying her family was deeply affected and would continue to support her son. She spoke not in defense of what had happened, but from a place of grief shared by many in the room. As the final sentencing orders were read aloud, the courtroom remained silent. No disruptions, no outbursts, just a quiet acknowledgement that a long and difficult case had reached its legal conclusion. But for those who had followed Glenara's story from the beginning, that silence was more than just a moment. It was the sound of consequences delayed, but no longer denied. Following the conclusion of court proceedings, the focus shifted from the individuals involved to the agencies entrusted with oversight. At the core of public concern was Hamilton County Job and Family Services, the agency responsible for evaluating the home Glenara was living in. The case had been officially closed weeks before her condition brought her to the hospital. That decision and the broader handling of her case prompted internal reviews and consequences. 2 employees assigned to her case file resigned from the department. 2 supervisory officials were placed on suspension. While no legal action was taken against agency staff, the department cited policy lapses and a failure to meet established standards during internal evaluations. The agency acknowledged that protocol had not been followed as required. Glenara's case was not shelved. It became a focal point in retraining efforts. Her file was used in internal sessions aimed at improving the identification of overlooked warning signs. Staff were retrained on procedures related to home assessments, caregiver reviews, and response timelines. Glenara's experience became part of an internal case study meant to reinforce the consequences of missed intervention opportunities. No new legislation was enacted as a direct result of the case, but Glenara's name surfaced repeatedly in local government hearings. County-level committees reviewed reunification procedures and oversight practices, using the case as an example of what happens when the system loses visibility into a child's safety. Dana Bradley, Glenara's maternal grandmother, pursued a federal lawsuit against the agency and named employees. The complaint alleged that Glenara was returned to an environment that had not been adequately reassessed. The case reached a settlement out of court, with the resolution kept confidential. Advocacy groups, including the Ohio Children's Alliance, highlighted Glenara's story in statewide awareness campaigns. They called for stricter safeguards before reunification and for ongoing monitoring when prior risk had already been established. In a public statement, then Agency Director Moira Weir addressed the case with uncharacteristic directness. "We didn't meet our own expectations," she said. "We were supposed to ensure a safe environment, and we didn't do enough." The response did not undo the outcome, but it did force the system to confront its own blind spots, and from that confrontation came a hard truth. Prevention doesn't start with tragedy. It starts with accountability. Neglect doesn't always show itself clearly. More often it hides in silence. A child who suddenly grows quiet, a student who stops making eye contact, missed medical visits, a shift in energy or engagement. These are signals, subtle but real, and they matter. In situations where something feels off, taking notice can make all the difference. Most states support anonymous reporting. You don't need proof, just a concern rooted in observation. That concern alone can initiate a check-in. It might be the one moment that shifts everything. Families and guardians must evaluate caregivers carefully. Familiarity doesn't guarantee safety. Whether it's a relative, partner, or trusted adult, every caregiver should be viewed through the lens of consistency, stability, and proven care. For educators, neighbors, and community members, awareness is protection. Behavior patterns, attendance, and sudden emotional withdrawal can be early cues. Staying observant doesn't require intrusion. It simply means staying alert. They should be the reason we all remain watchful. If you believe in protection that goes beyond policy, in prevention that starts with observation, and in voices that carry weight even after they're no longer heard, then share her story. Not for the numbers, but for the awareness. Because for Glenara, and for others in quiet danger, visibility is the first step to protection.
She can cry all the tears she wants, but she deserves what she got. It's going to bring me a little bit of peace, but it's going to take some time for what she's done and what my brother has done.
The boy was lying still, unnaturally quiet for someone so young. His frame, frail and motionless, barely made an imprint on the floor. Eyes that once lit up at the mention of Pokemon and space shuttles now seemed distant and empty. First responders said the room felt cold in a way they couldn't explain, not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of life. And yet, this wasn't some hidden shelter overseas. This was a modest family home in a peaceful Utah neighborhood. He hadn't been missing. There were no urgent press briefings, no flashing alerts. He was there the entire time, right inside the house, hidden just beyond the reach of those who might have helped, while the world outside went on, unaware. When the truth finally surfaced, it was almost unimaginable, not just because of what had happened, but because of how many chances there were to intervene. Teachers noticed, neighbors suspected, reports were filed, and yet every concern echoed into a silence that never responded. This is not a story about a child who simply got lost in the system. It's about a boy who was seen repeatedly and still left in danger. And what's even more chilling? Those responsible weren't strangers. They were familiar faces, smiling in public, clocking into jobs, waving to neighbors. Behind closed doors, a very different reality unfolded, one that no one imagined or perhaps chose not to. In the months that followed, the courtroom would unearth a family dynamic so fractured it defied belief. Legal documents and testimonies painted a picture of control, manipulation, and prolonged silence, a picture that, once fully revealed, stunned an entire community. This case may be difficult to hear, not because of sensationalism, but because it highlights how silence can be just as damaging as action, and how warning signs, when ignored, can lead to consequences that can never be undone. If you're new here, we cover real cases that deserve attention, especially those the system tried to forget. Please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. To our loyal subscribers, your likes, shares, and heartfelt comments help give voice to these stories. We are deeply grateful. Now, let's begin the story of Gavin Peterson. Gavin Peterson was born on January 15, 2012, in Ogden, Utah. From his earliest years, he stood out for his gentle nature and inquisitive mind. Those who knew him described him as joyful and endlessly curious. He had a fascination with science, especially space, and could often be found talking about rockets, stars, and planets. He loved to learn. His favorite color was blue, and like many boys his age, he was passionate about Pokemon and video games. But Gavin wasn't just bright, he was kind. He had a quiet way of making people feel at ease. Teachers later remembered how eager he was to help his classmates. At home, he had a natural sensitivity to the emotions of those around him. Gavin was the youngest of 3 siblings. His older brother Tyler had unique needs due to developmental challenges, and his sister Melanie often stepped in as a nurturing presence to both of her younger brothers. There was a closeness among them, built during their early years when they all lived under one roof with their mother and father. His parents, Melanie and Shane Peterson, began encountering serious challenges during Gavin's early years. In 2014, when Gavin was just 2 years old, a situation prompted law enforcement to conduct a welfare check at the family home. Officers noted that Gavin had been found outside without supervision, which raised immediate concerns. A further review of the home revealed conditions that were considered inappropriate for young children, prompting involvement from state authorities. The findings led the court to take protective action. All 3 children, Gavin, his older sister Melanie, and his brother Tyler, were placed in the care of other family members while an official case was opened. Melanie was issued a plan by the court, which included completing parenting courses, undergoing assessments, and participating in support programs designed to improve the stability of her household. To her credit, Melanie complied. She enrolled in every class, met with the necessary professionals, and completed her obligations without delay. Reports show she maintained consistent contact with her caseworker and worked actively toward meeting the expectations outlined by the court. However, reunification decisions can be slow-moving, especially when multiple agencies are involved. Despite her efforts, the timeline to regain custody continued to stretch. By the time her case reached a point where custody could be reconsidered, circumstances had shifted. The children had transitioned into the care of their father, Shane, and during this period, Shane had entered a new relationship. His partner, Nicolee Scott, gradually became a central figure in the home. Nicolee Scott's presence was, at first, unremarkable. She moved into the family's life quietly, offering support and appearing committed to the responsibilities that came with caring for 3 children. Gavin was only 3 when Nicole became a regular part of his world. What followed over the years would not be marked by dramatic events visible to the outside, but by gradual changes that would later be revealed through testimony, records, and lived experience. When Nicole Scott entered the Peterson household, she did so without drawing attention. There were no visible signs of tension, no major disruptions. On the surface, she appeared to be taking on a step-parent role in a household, adjusting to new custody dynamics. But over time, her role expanded, quietly at first. Then, with growing intensity, Nicole gradually became the primary authority figure in the home. What began as helping with routines and responsibilities soon evolved into firm control over the children's daily lives. Within a year, she was overseeing school schedules, setting house rules, and managing how the children interacted with others, including their mother. Milani, the eldest sibling, became the focus of increasing restrictions. As she grew into adolescence, she questioned Nicole's growing authority. In response, Nicole intensified supervision. Milani later shared with investigators that rules became more rigid. Access to personal items was limited, and communication with her biological mother was closely monitored. Surveillance systems were installed in multiple rooms. Every move within the home was carefully tracked. Tyler, the middle child, received noticeably different treatment. Nicole appeared to favor him, offering extra privileges and easing restrictions. According to statements made later in the case, Tyler was subtly encouraged to monitor his siblings and report their behavior. Over time, this approach widened the emotional gap between the children and increased their reliance on Nicole's approval. By 2019, Nicole's influence was deeply embedded. She began managing household routines to the point where even simple activities like mealtimes, phone use, and attending regular school functions became heavily controlled. Around this time, Melanie, the children's mother, began raising concerns. During scheduled visits, she observed changes in Gavin's demeanor and overall well-being. In February 2020, she captured photographs to support her concerns and submitted them to the Division of Child and Family Services. Rather than launch a formal inquiry into the environment Gavin and his siblings were living in, the agency suspended Melanie's visitation rights. Records later revealed that Nicole had filed a counterclaim stating that Melanie's concerns were baseless. DCFS responded by putting visitation on hold pending further review. That review never came. By the close of 2020, both Milani and Melanie were effectively removed from Gavin's life. Milani, his older sister, had long been one of his strongest sources of comfort, but over time, her relationship with Nicole grew increasingly strained. What began as quiet tension escalated into a pattern of control that left Milani isolated. As the situation became more restrictive, Milani made the decision to leave, hoping to reconnect with her mother and find stability elsewhere. That decision led to a serious turning point in mid-2019. Following an attempt to leave the home without permission, Melanie faced consequences that drastically altered her daily life. She was no longer allowed to attend school and became increasingly cut off from outside contact. According to her later statements, she felt unable to express what she was experiencing, and attempts to reach out went unanswered. The defining moment came during Memorial Day weekend in 2019. Melanie had been asked to complete yard work, something she was accustomed to doing. While using a lawnmower, she accidentally broke a sprinkler. Nicole was reportedly asleep at the time, but Shane Peterson, their father, witnessed the incident. Melanie anticipated a lecture or a trip to replace the part. Instead, Shane instructed her to get into the car. They drove in silence. Instead of going to a store, Shane brought her directly to her mother's residence. Without offering a reason, he dropped her off and left. Melanie later described the moment as jarring. Melanie's appearance had changed, and her energy was noticeably different. She opened up about the difficulties she had faced in the home, and her mother immediately contacted authorities. A report was filed with the Weber County Sheriff's Office. The Department of Child and Family Services was also notified following the holiday. Although Melanie was now living with her mother, no formal intervention followed. Despite multiple reports and repeated attempts to escalate the matter, no substantial review was conducted. Melanie remained in her mother's care from that point forward. Gavin, however, stayed behind. The bond he shared with his sister, one built through years of shared experiences and mutual support, was severed. With Melanie and Melanie now outside the picture, those closest to Gavin were no longer present in his daily life. And inside the home, the environment continued on, with fewer eyes watching and even fewer willing to question what was happening. In the final months, Gavin was seen outside the home. Quiet signs of concern began to emerge. These weren't dramatic events or high-profile alerts. They were subtle observations, noticed only by those who were paying close attention. And in the places Gavin still had limited interaction with the world, those quiet concerns started to surface. During the 2022-2023 school year, Gavin's teachers began to see small but noticeable changes. He was always a quiet child, but now his energy had faded. His attendance became irregular. He appeared more withdrawn, and staff began to notice shifts in his mood and physical presence. These weren't accusations, just concerns, unspoken but shared. Inside the school cafeteria, one worker named Jan became quietly watchful. She noticed Gavin's habit of standing near the trash bins after lunch. At first, it seemed like a child stalling or throwing something away. But after watching this happen more than once, John began to realize that he wasn't loitering. He was looking for something. Discreetly, she started covering the cost of his school meals herself, topping up his lunch account so he could have consistent access without drawing attention. For a time, it was the only certainty in his school day. That changed when Nicole contacted the school. She demanded to know why Gavin had been receiving meals without her knowledge. She stated firmly that if he was to be provided lunch, she would handle the cost directly. After that phone call, Jan and the staff were instructed not to interfere, and shortly after, Gavin was removed from school altogether. In August 2023, Nicole informed the school district that Gavin would now be homeschooled. No further explanation was offered. After that, Gavin was no longer present on school rosters, and staff who had quietly watched over him had no way to reach out. He had disappeared from public view entirely. For nearly a year, there were no updates, no records, and no interactions that might have prompted an outside check-in. Gavin's world had become fully private, with no institutional oversight. Those who had once tried to help now had no way of knowing what was happening behind closed doors. In early July 2024, a text message was sent by Tyler Peterson, Gavin's older brother, to their father, Shane. The message expressed concern that Gavin wasn't acting like himself, that something seemed off, that he appeared unusually quiet and unwell. It wasn't a medical opinion, but it signaled that something had changed. The response from Shane did not result in urgent action. Within the same week, an urgent call was placed to 911 from the Peterson home. Emergency personnel responded and found Gavin in a state that required immediate medical attention. When officers arrived at the Peterson residence on July 9, 2024, they were responding to a call for medical assistance. Paramedics were already tending to Gavin, but something about the scene prompted closer attention. The environment inside the home felt unusually restrained. Details that typically align with daily life were missing, and initial explanations didn't fully line up with what police observed. Within hours, detectives from the Weber County Sheriff's Office opened a formal investigation. As they walked through the house, they found areas that seemed out of sync with what had been described. One bedroom, in particular, appeared nearly empty, lacking in comfort, personal items, or signs of normal use. The room was said to be where Gavin had been staying while feeling unwell. The initial walkthrough raised more questions than answers. Investigators expanded their search and quickly identified several disconnected surveillance cameras throughout the house. While not unusual for security purposes, the placement of these cameras raised questions. They were small motion-sensitive devices, recently removed from their locations but still operational when tested. Later, a shed in the backyard revealed where the missing equipment had been stored. Alongside the cameras were phones and memory cards that had been wiped or relocated. Investigators secured the devices and began a digital analysis. What emerged from the data was revealing. Text messages recovered from the phones included conversations between Nicole, Shane, and Tyler discussing household restrictions placed on Gavin. One message referenced limiting his access to meals as a form of discipline. Another discussed securing his bedroom door during certain hours. While these texts alone were not definitive, they indicated that Gavin's day-to-day life had been tightly regulated. Further analysis uncovered deleted files from surveillance apps, video segments that had not been fully erased. They showed extended footage of Gavin alone in a nearly bare room with minimal activity over long periods. The content lacked clear context, but the pattern of isolation was evident. These digital records became a crucial part of the investigation. During the search, officers also found a small quantity of unauthorized substances stored in the kitchen. This discovery led to additional charges unrelated to the primary case, but reinforced concerns about the overall environment. As interviews continued, inconsistencies began to surface. Nicole and Shane provided varying accounts of when Gavin last appeared ill, what he had eaten, and how long they had been monitoring his condition. Each retelling introduced new timelines, and the lack of alignment between their statements raised red flags. At the medical facility, doctors completed an initial evaluation and reported that Gavin's condition reflected a long-term health decline associated with severe nutritional deprivation. Though further analysis would follow, physicians confirmed that these issues had developed gradually, not suddenly. At the time of admission, Gavin weighed less than 60 pounds, a measurement well below the expected range for someone his age. Hospital staff with decades of clinical experience quietly noted that this level of deterioration was rarely seen in typical settings. The focus of the investigation now shifted. It was no longer just about a single incident. It had become a search for how this situation unfolded over such a long period, and why every opportunity to intervene had fallen short. The legal proceedings that followed Gavin's case unfolded over several months, drawing close attention from the public, legal community, and child advocacy professionals across Utah. The Second District Court in Ogden became the setting for a series of formal hearings that exposed decisions, failures, and a household dynamic that had largely gone unchecked for years. Shane Peterson, Gavin's father, was the first to face the court. In March 2025, he entered a plea of guilty to multiple felony charges, including an offense defined under Utah law as causing harm leading to loss of life due to prolonged neglect. As part of his plea deal, prosecutors agreed not to pursue elevated charges. On May 6th, Judge Camille Nider sentenced him to an indeterminate term of 5 years to life in the Utah State Prison. Shane declined to speak at sentencing, offering no personal explanation. Tyler Peterson, Gavin's older brother, was also charged in connection with the case. His situation, however, was addressed with additional layers of review. Tyler was evaluated by 2 court-appointed mental health professionals, both of whom determined that his decision-making and behavior were influenced by clinical factors requiring long-term care. With the agreement of the court, Tyler entered a guilty plea to reduce charges and was released under structured supervision. He was placed in the care of his mother, Melanie Peterson, with mandatory mental health treatment and ongoing monitoring. Nicole Scott, the stepmother at the center of the case, initially denied involvement, but by April 2025 she changed her plea. She appeared in court and admitted guilt to multiple felony charges, including obstruction and offenses involving the prolonged mistreatment of a dependent child. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Nicole did not offer a public statement. Prosecutors described her actions as part of an intentional pattern of controlling behavior. During sentencing, Judge Nider addressed Nicole directly. Her statement was pointed and measured. She referred to Nicole as the primary force behind Gavin's prolonged suffering, drawing a sharp comparison to conditions historically associated with extreme deprivation and control. The courtroom remained silent as the judge made clear that this was not a case rooted in poverty or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate breakdown of responsibility. The most emotional moment came when Melanie Peterson took the stand. In her victim impact statement, Melanie spoke about the bond she shared with her younger brother. Her words were calm but deeply personal.
Manipulated me into hating my mom. She called me names every day. At that time, I was mostly focused on surviving. They would starve me until I was really skinny.
She described the helplessness she felt after being separated from Gavin and the weight of knowing she couldn't return to help him. Her voice did not waver, but the pain in her testimony was unmistakable. Her statement left a lasting impact on those present. The prosecution emphasized the long timeline of missed opportunities, reports filed, warnings raised, visits requested but not acted upon. The defense acknowledged the facts presented and asked the court to weigh the circumstances surrounding each defendant's mental and emotional condition. But the evidence was clear, and the court had no difficulty reaching a resolution. By the end of the spring term, all 3 individuals charged in connection with Gavin's case had entered guilty pleas. Legal accountability had been delivered. But the full impact of what happened in that home extended far beyond the courtroom. For those who lived it and those who had only just begun to understand the scope, the reckoning had only begun. In the aftermath of the courtroom proceedings, a deeper examination revealed another layer of accountability, this time within the systems designed to protect children. Gavin's case wasn't hidden. It was documented. He had been the subject of multiple official reports at least 7 separate times, filed with Utah's Division of Child and Family Services. These reports came from school staff, extended family, and others who had observed changes or voiced concern, but time and again the response was limited. Cases were closed without follow-up or marked unsubstantiated, leaving no further obligation for investigation. Educators saw the signs. Gavin's behavior shifted, his presence at school grew inconsistent, and staff noted a decline in his participation and well-being. But procedural boundaries prevented them from taking direct action. Without a visible injury or clear disclosure, they had no grounds to demand deeper review. When Gavin was formally withdrawn from school in August 2023, oversight ended altogether. Utah's homeschooling laws do not require in-person check-ins or educational monitoring unless specific red flags are triggered. In Gavin's case, no such flags were officially recorded, despite a growing history of concern. For DCFS workers, the legal threshold for home visits remained high. Without a new complaint or clear evidence of immediate danger, there were no tools in place to override parental authority, even when older reports suggested patterns of concern. Meanwhile, Melanie Peterson continued to pursue legal avenues. She filed motions, submitted appeals, and contacted agencies directly. But with limited access to current records and no custody rights at that stage, her influence was legally constrained. As the timeline became public, so did a devastating question. How could a child be mentioned this many times in official records by different people in different settings and still go unseen when it mattered most? July 19, 2024, a quiet vigil was held outside the Peterson home. Community members gathered under the evening sky, some holding candles, others bringing handwritten signs and photographs. Many had never met Gavin, but they were there for a reason. Teachers, neighbors, school cafeteria workers all stood together, marking a moment that had changed their town. The local response soon reached the state level. Utah Representative Christine Watkins introduced House Bill 83 legislation aimed at expanding DCFS authority. The bill proposed allowing the agency to seek emergency court orders for wellness checks when repeated reports went unresolved. It was designed to give frontline workers a path forward in cases that fell into procedural limbo. Despite strong support from child welfare advocates and educators, the bill stalled in committee in January 2025. Lawmakers raised concerns about due process rights and agency resources. For many following the case, it felt like another door had quietly closed. In the wake of the decision, the director of DCFS issued a public statement promising to reassess internal response protocols and explore alternative solutions. Media outlets across the country covered the case, and Gavin's name became tied to a broader conversation about what visibility really means and how responsibility must extend beyond documentation. The vigil, though small in scale, symbolized something larger, a shift in awareness. A shared realization that silence, whether institutional or personal, can carry a cost. And while the legislative effort may have paused, the conversation had only begun. Gavin Peterson's story is not one of being overlooked. He was noticed, his name was spoken, concerns were raised. What failed him wasn't awareness, it was follow-through. In the end, Gavin wasn't lost in the shadows. He was failed by a system that paused when it needed to act. His case challenges common assumptions about safety. Gavin lived in a quiet neighborhood. There were no public disruptions, nothing that on the surface would prompt urgent alarm. And yet within that routine exterior, decisions were made that slowly pushed him out of reach. Not because no one knew, but because the mechanisms designed to respond didn't move fast enough. There are key lessons here, ones that can't be ignored. Serious mistreatment can occur anywhere, even in stable-looking homes. Oversight matters. Homeschooling, while valid for many, must include appropriate checks when prior concerns exist. School staff need more authority to escalate red flags when they appear. And trust, especially in caregiving settings, must always be paired with verification. Familiar roles do not guarantee safety. If something doesn't feel right, say something. Say it early, say it again, and most importantly, follow it through. Protecting a child doesn't begin when harm is confirmed. It begins when doubt first arises. Subscribe, share, and help elevate the voices that too often go unheard. Silence may feel neutral, but in cases like this, it can be the very thing that allows harm to continue unnoticed.